The sun was a hammer against the anvil of the sky, beating down on the dust-choked canyon until the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat. Caleb Danner felt it on the back of his neck, a familiar weight, as his dun gelding picked its way along the fence line. The posts were weathered to the color of bone, the wire stretched taut against the vast, empty expanse of eastern New Mexico. This was his world now. Harsh sun, dry brush, and a silence so complete it felt like a presence of its own. He rode with his shoulders slumped just so, a habit learned from years of trying not to be noticed. His face, shadowed by the brim of a sweat-stained hat, was a map of hard miles and harder memories. The lines around his eyes etched deeper than a man of 30-odd years had a right to. He checked each post, his gaze sweeping the horizon out of instinct. 10 years he'd been here. 10 years of raising cattle that were leaner than he was, of mending fences and patching the roof of a cabin that was little more than a box to keep the weather out. 10 years of trying to sweat the past out of his skin. But the past had a way of clinging, like the fine red dust that settled on everything he owned. It came to him in moments like this, in the lonely quiet with nothing but the plodding of hooves and the creak of worn leather for company. He saw a flicker of movement in the sagebrush. A lizard. Nothing more. But for a half-second, his hand twitched toward the Colt Peacemaker holstered low on his hip. The motion was fluid, ingrained, a ghost of another man in another life. The memory rose unbidden, tasting of gun smoke and cheap whiskey. A torch arcing through a black night, landing on the dry roof of a sod-roofed homestead. The orange bloom of the fire, the sudden, terrible screams from inside. He saw the face of Silas Durant, the man who had raised him from a boy, his teeth yellow in the firelight as he laughed. A lesson, Caleb, Durant had said, his voice a gravelly rasp. They learn to pay, or they learn to burn. They were supposed to be collecting a debt from a stubborn farmer who had crossed them, not burning a family alive. But the farmer's wife had come out with a shotgun, her face pale with terror and defiance. And Durant's patience, always a thin and brittle thing, had snapped. Caleb could still see the woman's eyes, wide with disbelief as the flames took hold, could still hear the thin wail of a child. He had frozen, his gun heavy and useless in his hand. He was 17, fast with a pistol but slow to understand the kind of evil that wears a human face. By the time he'd broken from his trance, it was too late. The betrayal wasn't that Durant had lied. It was that Caleb had believed him. He'd believed in the gang's code, in a rough sort of justice. But there was no justice in the ashes of that home, only the stench of charred wood and cooked meat. He had ridden away that night, the screams following him, and he had not stopped riding until the name Caleb Danner was a whisper and the Durant gang was a story told by other men. The sky, which had been a relentless, empty blue all day, was beginning to bruise with clouds in the west. A storm was coming. The air grew heavy, the familiar smell of rain on dry earth a welcome promise. Caleb turned his horse toward home, a small, dark shape against the immensity of the mesa. He preferred the storms. The thunder was loud enough to drown out the ghosts. By the time he reached his cabin, the wind was whipping dust into his eyes and the first fat drops of rain were beginning to fall. He unsaddled the gelding, his movements economical and sure, and led him into the small, sturdy barn he'd built with his own 2 hands. The rain was coming down in earnest now, a driving sheet of water that turned the world gray. He was halfway to the cabin door when he saw it, a heap of something near the side of the barn, something that did not belong. He approached cautiously, his hand resting on the grip of his Colt. It was a bundle of gray wool, a threadbare blanket soaked through and plastered to the ground. Then he saw a foot, pale and bare, sticking out from under it. He knelt, the rain running in rivers from his hat brim, and pulled the blanket back. It was a woman. Her face was turned to the side, pressed into the mud, her dark hair matted with dirt and rain. He gently turned her over. Her eyes were closed, her lips blue with cold. A dark bruise bloomed across one cheekbone, stark against her pale skin. She was shivering violently, her body racked with tremors that seemed too powerful for her slender frame. She looked half-starved, her bones sharp beneath the thin, wet wool. Caleb's first instinct was to walk away. This was trouble. Trouble was the one thing he had spent a decade avoiding. People brought trouble. A woman like this, beaten and left for dead, brought the worst kind. He should get on his horse, ride to town, and tell the sheriff. Let the law handle it, but he knew Sheriff Barnes. The man was long on talk and short on action, especially when it came to things that might prove difficult. By the time Barnes rode out here, if he came at all, this woman would be a corpse. He looked at her face, at the faint flutter of her eyelashes, and the memory of those screams in the night returned to him, sharp and clear. He had stood by and done nothing then. He could not do it again. With a curse that was lost in the roar of the wind, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed. The blanket was her only covering, and as he lifted her, it fell away slightly, revealing a landscape of more bruises on her arms and shoulders. He pulled it tight around her and carried her through the downpour and into the dry warmth of his cabin. He laid her on the cot that served as his bed, the only one he had. For a long moment, he just stood there, dripping rainwater onto the floorboards, looking at the fragile, broken thing he had brought into his home. He was no doctor. He did not know the first thing about tending to a woman, but he knew about wounds. He stoked the fire in the stone hearth until it blazed, then lit a lantern, its yellow light pushing back the stormy gloom. He filled a basin with water from the pump and heated it over the flames. He found a clean rag and, with hesitant hands, began to clean the mud from her face. She moaned softly, a low, animal sound of pain, and her eyes flickered open. They were the color of a stormy sky, a deep, turbulent gray, and for a second, they were wild with terror. She tried to pull away, her body tensing. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You are safe here." She stared at him, her gaze darting from his face to the door, to the rifle mounted over the fireplace. He saw the fight in her eyes, a stubborn spark of defiance that seemed at odds with her broken body. He held up his hands, showing they were empty. "I am not going to hurt you." She did not seem convinced, but her strength gave out. Her eyes closed again, and she went limp. Caleb took a steadying breath and continued his work. He cleaned a long, shallow cut on her forehead and another on her arm. Her skin was cold to the touch. As he carefully dabbed at a scrape on her forearm, he saw the old scars. They circled both of her wrists, pale, puckered lines against her skin. Rope burns, old ones, but unmistakable. Someone had kept her tied. The thought sent a cold, hard knot of anger into his gut. He found an old shirt of his, clean but worn soft with age, and managed to get her out of the wet blanket and into it without looking more than he had to. He covered her with the dry blankets from his bedroll. She shivered still, but less violently now. He sat in the single wooden chair by the fire, watching her breathe, listening to the rain lash against the windows. He had brought the world into his quiet life, and he had a feeling it would not be leaving any time soon. She woke a few hours later. The storm had lessened to a steady drumming on the roof. She was propped up on his pillow, the firelight casting flickering shadows across her bruised face. She watched him for a full minute before she spoke, her voice a dry whisper. "Where am I?" "My cabin," he said, not moving from his chair. "Found you by the barn." She tried to sit up, wincing as her sore muscles protested. She pulled the blankets tighter around her neck. "Who are you?" "Caleb Danner." He waited for her to offer her own name, but she remained silent. Her eyes scanned the small room, taking in the rough-hewn table, the sparse shelves, the lack of anything personal save for a few worn books. She looked at everything but the small, cracked piece of mirror hanging by the door. "What is your name?" he asked finally. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were clenched in the blanket. "Elise," she said, the name offered up like a secret she was reluctant to part with. Just Elise. Who did this to you, Elise? Her chin lifted, and that spark of defiance was back in her eyes. No one. It was a lie, plain and simple, but Caleb did not push. He knew a wall when he saw one. He had built enough of them himself. He stood and ladled some broth from a pot he had set to simmer on the fire. He had made it for himself, but it was all he had to offer. He brought it to her. She flinched as he got close, a small, almost imperceptible movement. But he saw it. He set the bowl on the small crate he used as a bedside table and backed away. You need to eat, he said. She stared at the bowl, then at him. She asked no questions about him, about where they were, about what he planned to do. It was as if she had been taught that questions were a dangerous currency. After a while, she drank the broth, her movements slow and pained. When she was done, Caleb took the empty bowl. You can have the bed, he told her. There's a small room in the back. You can stay there. He gestured to a door behind him. It is not much. He turned to go, needing to put space between them. The sight of her, so broken yet so proud, stirred something in him he had long thought dead. I do not need your charity, she whispered to his back. He stopped, his hand on the door latch. It is not charity, he said without turning around. But you should know, I am no good company. He heard a soft, rustling sound as she shifted in the bed. Her voice, when it came, was laced with a bitterness that went bone deep, better than the last one. A week passed. The silence in the cabin changed. It was no longer the empty silence of solitude, but a heavy, watchful silence, filled with the presence of another person. Elise moved like a ghost through his home. She stayed in the small, windowless storage room he had cleared for her, emerging only when she thought he was outside. He would leave food for her on the table, and when he returned, it would be gone. The plate scrubbed clean and put away. He noticed she never looked at her reflection in the window panes or the cracked mirror. She was healing, the bruises on her face fading from a violent purple to a sickly yellow-green. But some deeper wound remained untouched. Caleb knew he needed supplies. Coffee was low, and he needed flour and salt. He needed an excuse to leave the suffocating quiet of the cabin. He told her he was riding into town, that he would be gone for most of the day. She just nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. She did not ask him to bring anything back for her. She did not ask for anything at all. The town, if one could call it that, was little more than a dusty street with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and the sheriff's office. People gave Caleb a wide berth. They knew he kept to himself, and they knew the look in his eyes was one that discouraged conversation. But today, he felt their stares more keenly. News traveled fast in a place this small, even without a clear story. He was tying his horse to the hitching post when Sheriff Barnes stepped out of his office. Barnes was a big man running to fat, his face perpetually flushed. He hooked his thumbs in his belt, trying to look imposing. "Danner," he said, his voice a low drawl. "Been a while?" "Sheriff," Caleb acknowledged, his tone flat. "Heard you got some company out at your place?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Heard wrong." Barnes chuckled, a humorless sound. "Folks talk. Caleb, Jedediah Smith's boy was hunting rabbits out your way a few days back. Said he saw a woman's shadow in your window. Rumors are spreading. Best you watch who you bring around. Some folks have long memories about men who used to ride with the likes of Silas Durant." The name hung in the air between them, an open threat. Caleb met the sheriff's gaze, his own eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "I am tending my own affairs. Sheriff, I suggest you do the same." He turned and walked into the general store without another word, leaving Barnes standing in the street. Inside, he bought his supplies, ignoring the whispers of the other customers and the pointed questions of the storekeeper. He paid his coin and left, the weight of the town's suspicion heavy on his shoulders. He was an outsider, and they would never let him forget it. Back at the cabin, Elise felt the walls closing in. The silence while he was gone was different, less watchful, but more empty. More like the silence she had known before, the kind that came with a locked door. Her body was mending, but her nerves were raw. This man, Caleb Danner, had shown her a rough kindness she did not understand. He fed her, sheltered her, and asked for nothing in return. It made her suspicious. Kindness always came with a price. Driven by a restless fear, she began to explore the small, two-room cabin. It was a man's space, sparse and functional. A rifle over the hearth, a set of worn-out spurs on a nail, a stack of books with cracked spines. There was nothing to tell her who he was, beyond a man who lived alone. Then she saw the small, locked drawer in the rickety table beside his chair. Her heart began to pound. Secrets were dangerous. Her whole life had been shaped by the dangerous secrets of men. She found a thin piece of wire by the fireplace and, with fingers that trembled slightly, she worked at the simple lock. It clicked open. Inside, there was only a dusty, oil-stained rag wrapped around something hard. She unwrapped it. It was a Colt revolver, older than the one he wore, its wooden grip worn smooth. Beneath it lay a folded, yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline was stark: "Durant Gang Strikes Again. Bank Robbery Leaves 3 Dead." The article detailed the exploits of the notorious outlaws, naming Silas Durant as their leader. And there, at the bottom of the column, was a list of known associates. The last name on the list was Caleb Danner. Elise stared at the name, her blood turning to ice. Her savior was a killer, an outlaw. He was one of them, the men she had spent her life fearing. But the man who had cleaned her wounds and given her his bed did not seem like the man described in the paper. It did not make sense. She carefully put the gun and the clipping back, locked the drawer, and retreated to her room, more afraid than ever. That night, the fear boiled over into fever. She woke up shivering, drenched in sweat, her thoughts tangled and confused. The cabin felt like a cage. Caleb Danner, its jailer. She had to get out. She had to run. It was the only thing she knew how to do. She slipped out of bed, her legs unsteady beneath her. She pulled on the boots he had left for her. They were too big, but they were better than nothing. Wrapped in the thin blanket from her cot, she eased the cabin door open and slipped out into the cold, moonless night. The air was a shock to her fevered skin. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to be away from that cabin, away from him. She made it 50 yards before her body betrayed her. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the world tilting and spinning. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed in a heap in the damp grass, the darkness swallowing her whole. Caleb found her there an hour later. He had been woken by a feeling of wrongness, the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere that told him he was alone again. He saw the open door and a cold dread seized him. He found her not far from the woodpile, curled into a tight ball, shivering uncontrollably. Her skin was burning with fever. He knelt beside her and, for the second time, lifted her into his arms. She was limp, mumbling words he could not understand. He carried her back inside, his expression grim. He kicked the door shut behind him, the sound echoing in the quiet cabin. He laid her on his bed, piling every blanket he owned on top of her. He did not say a word. There were no words for this. There was only the quiet work of survival, a language they both understood. The next morning, the fever had broken. Elise woke slowly, feeling as though she were swimming up from a great depth. The first thing she noticed was the warmth. She was cocooned in a mountain of heavy wool blankets. The second was the smell of coffee and bacon. She opened her eyes. A plate of food sat on the crate beside the bed. 2 strips of bacon, a piece of cornbread, and a tin cup of steaming coffee. Sunlight streamed through the single window, cutting a dusty gold bar across the wooden floor. She turned her head. Caleb was sitting in his chair by the cold hearth, staring into the ashes. He was not looking at her. He was looking at something far away, something only he could see. His face was tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than before. He held a rifle across his lap, cleaning it with slow, methodical strokes, his hands steady. He had been up all night, watching over her. He must have felt her gaze, because he stopped his work. He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were distant, filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to have no bottom. He did not smile. He did not speak. He just looked at her, and in that silent, weary gaze, Elise saw not the ghost of a killer, but the reflection of her own brokenness. And for the first time since she had stumbled onto this land, she did not feel the urge to run. The days settled into a rhythm of quiet tension. Elise's body healed, the bruises on her skin fading to faint, yellowish stains, but a deeper malady clung to her spirit. Nightmares were her constant companions, tearing muffled cries from her throat in the dead of night. Caleb would hear them from his bedroll by the fire, his hands clenching into fists. But he never went to her. He sensed her shame was a wild animal. To approach it directly would only make it lash out or retreat further into the darkness. She moved through his cabin with a phantom's grace, taking up almost no space at all. She would not eat when he was in the room. He would leave a plate on the table and go outside, and when he returned, the plate would be clean and stacked by the water basin, as if it had emptied itself. He learned to time his trips to the creek for water, knowing she would use his absence to bathe. He would come back to the scent of soap in the air and the sight of her dark hair, damp and combed, and he would feel a strange tightening in his chest, a feeling he had no name for. He told himself it was pity. He threw himself into his work, seeking the familiar ache of labor to distract him from the woman watching him from his own window. He repaired the section of fence in the south pasture, his movements precise and forceful as he dug post holes and stretched the sharp wire taut. The sun beat down on his back, sweat tracing clean paths through the dust on his skin, but he barely felt it. He was aware, always, of her gaze. He never looked toward the cabin, never acknowledged her presence there, but he felt it like a pressure against his spine. He would see a flicker of movement in the reflection of a water trough, the slight shift of a curtain, and he would drive the post maul down with a little more force than was necessary. He spent 2 days chopping wood, building a formidable stack against the cabin wall for the coming chill of autumn. The rhythmic thud of the axe was a conversation with himself. Each swing was a memory pushed away. Each splintering log a moment of guilt split open and cast aside. He pretended not to notice how she stood in the doorway for a few minutes each afternoon, a silhouette against the dark interior of the cabin, her arms wrapped around herself as she watched him work. He pretended the steady, powerful motion of his body was just a chore that needed doing, and not a silent display of the strength he kept so carefully leashed. One afternoon, a rider approached. It was Amos Pritchard, a neighbor from a small ranch 5 miles to the east. Amos was a man whose curiosity always outmatched his manners. He reined in his horse near the woodpile, his eyes flicking from Caleb to the cabin door and back again. "Danner," Amos said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near Caleb's boots. "Working hard, I see." Caleb rested his axe and wiped his brow with the back of a forearm, his face an impassive mask. Amos grinned, a network of deep lines crinkling around his eyes. "Heard you took in a stray." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rasp. "Some folks are saying you have a woman out here. A real beat-up little thing, they say." His gaze was fixed on the cabin, hungry for a glimpse. "Always did have a soft spot for harboring broken things, did you not? First that lame horse, now this." Oh. Caleb's body went rigid. He saw a flicker of movement in the window, the curtain falling back into place. She had heard. The air grew still and heavy, without a word. Caleb took 2 long strides toward Amos's horse. Before the man could react, Caleb's arm shot out, his fist connecting with Amos's jaw in a solid, ugly crunch of bone and cartilage. Amos flew backward out of his saddle and landed in a heap in the dust. Groaning, his horse shied away, its eyes wide. Caleb stood over him, his chest heaving, his knuckles already swelling. He did not say a word. He just stared down at the man with an expression so cold and final that Amos scrambled backward in the dirt, his eyes filled with a sudden, genuine fear. He got to his feet, holding his jaw, and stumbled toward his horse without looking back. He mounted clumsily and kicked the animal into a gallop, disappearing in a cloud of his own dust. Caleb watched him go, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Then he turned and saw Elise standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. She looked at his bruised hand, then at his face. He expected fear, or maybe even revulsion. Instead, he saw a flicker of something else, something fragile and uncertain. Later that evening, as he sat cleaning his rifle, she approached him. She stood before his chair, her hands twisting in the folds of the worn dress he had bought for her in town, along with a few other practical things he'd left on her cot without a word. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so soft he barely heard it. He did not look up from his work. "For what?" "For what you did with that man." He shrugged, pushing a clean rag through the rifle barrel. "He had it coming. No one has ever done that for me." The admission was quiet, heavy with a history he could only guess at. He finally looked at her. Her stormy gray eyes were fixed on him, searching for something. "You do not owe me anything, Elise." A sad, bitter little smile touched her lips. "That is what they all say," she replied, and turned away, leaving him alone with the weight of her words. That night, she could not escape the memories. They came for her in the suffocating darkness of her little room, pulling her back to a place she had fought so hard to flee. She was 16 again, standing in the parlor of her father's house, the air thick with the smell of stale whiskey and despair. Her father, a man hollowed out by drink and failure, was smiling a desperate, sweating smile at the visitor. The visitor was William Harrow. Harrow was a man who owned half the valley and acted as if he owned the sky above it. He was handsome in a severe, predatory way, his clothes impeccable, his eyes the color of cold, hard cash. He looked at Elise not as a man looks at a woman, but as a rancher looks at a prize filly he is about to purchase. "She is a beauty, is she not?" her father slurred, his hand heavy on Elise's shoulder. "Strong, healthy." "She has spirit," Harrow had said, his voice smooth as polished stone. He reached out and tilted her chin up with one finger. "I like spirit. It is amusing to tame." And just like that, she was sold. Her father's gambling debts were settled, and she became the property of William Harrow. She lived in his grand house, a gilded cage filled with fine furniture and suffocating silence. He dressed her in expensive gowns, but forbade her from speaking unless spoken to. He paraded her before his guests like a beautiful, silent ornament. He called her his ward, but she knew what she was. She was a possession. The first time she fought back, refusing one of his cold, possessive advances. He did not raise his voice. He simply rang a small silver bell. Two of his ranch hands came, their faces impassive. They held her down while Harrow himself struck her with his riding crop. The blows precise and passionless, meant not to maim but to instruct. Property does not have a will of its own. "Elise," he had told her, his voice calm as he stood over her weeping form. "It has only the will of its owner. You will learn this." After that, when her defiance still flickered, he had them lock her in the root cellar for days at a time. The darkness and the cold became her world. It was there, in the damp, earthy blackness, that she learned to build walls inside herself. It was there she promised herself that one day she would run until her feet bled, that she would die in the desert before she ever let him touch her again. The scars on her wrists were from the one time she had tried to break free, a frantic, failed attempt that had earned her a week in ropes. The memory was so vivid she could feel the bite of the cord against her skin. and she woke up with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. A few days later, Caleb rode out to check on a sick calf at the far end of his property. Elise watched him go, a speck of a man against the vast landscape. The cabin felt safer with him in it, a fact that terrified her. She knew from the newspaper clipping that he was a dangerous man, but his danger felt different from Harrow's. Harrow's was the cold, calculated cruelty of a master. Caleb's felt like a fire banked low, a thing he fought to keep contained. Her curiosity gnawed at her. She needed to understand the man who had punched a neighbor for her but would not meet her eyes. She found his saddlebags lying by the door where he'd dropped them. Her hands trembled as she unbuckled the leather straps. Inside, alongside a whetstone and some dried jerky, was a small leather pouch. She opened it. The first thing she saw was a small, tarnished badge, a crudely star-shaped piece of tin with the letter D stamped in the center. The Durant Gang. It was real. He had been one of them. Beneath it was a pair of leather riding gloves. They were stiff and stained with dark, reddish-brown patches that could only be old blood. A wave of nausea washed over her. She saw him in her mind's eye, wearing these gloves, his gun smoking. Then she saw the letter. It was tucked into a pocket of the pouch, the paper soft and fragile. The ink faded. It was written in a delicate, feminine hand. She unfolded it carefully. "My dearest Caleb," it began. "If you are reading this, then the world has taken its final due from me. Do not blame yourself. I beg you, do not carry this. The fire was not your fault. It was theirs. The life you chose, the path you walked. I knew it was dangerous, but I saw the good in you. Caleb, I still do. Do not let the darkness they carry become your own. You were meant to protect, not to destroy. Find a piece of land. Find some peace. Live a life worthy of the love I will carry with me. Wherever I go, do not let my memory be a ghost that haunts you, but a light that guides you home. I love you. Always. Yours, Rachel." Elise read the letter twice, her heart aching for the man she barely knew and the woman he had lost. Rachel. So this was the source of his sorrow. This was the ghost that looked out from his eyes. He was not just a killer. He was a man who had loved and lost. A man drowning in a grief so deep he could not speak its name. She folded the letter, her hands gentle, and placed everything back in the saddlebag exactly as she had found it. She now held his deepest secrets, and the knowledge was a heavy, intimate weight. That night, the sky broke open. A furious thunderstorm rolled in off the plains, the thunder shaking the very foundations of the small cabin. Each clap was like a gunshot, each flash of lightning a whip crack across the sky. For Elise, the storm was not outside. It was in the room with her, in her head. The booming thunder was Harrow's voice. The lightning was the flash of his silver bell. She curled into a ball on her cot, her hands over her ears, but she could not block it out. The walls of the small room pressed in on her, the darkness alive and breathing. She was back in the root cellar. The door bolted shut, the sound of his footsteps walking away overhead. She could not breathe. Her chest was a tight, iron band. A scream built in her throat, a raw, primal sound of pure terror. And she could not hold it back. The door to her room burst open. Caleb stood there, silhouetted against the firelight, a pistol in his hand. "What is it? What is wrong?" He saw her then, huddled in the corner, shaking uncontrollably, her eyes wide and unseeing. He lowered the gun. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt before her. "Elise," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Look at me. You are safe." But she could not hear him. She was lost, drowning in the memory. He reached for her, and she flinched violently. Crying out, he ignored it. He pulled her into his arms, wrapping them around her tightly, holding her thrashing body against his own. She fought him for a moment, her fists beating weakly against his chest. But he held on. his grip an unbreakable anchor. "It is just a storm," he murmured into her hair, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "Just rain and wind. I am here. You are not there. You are here with me." He repeated the words over and over, his voice a steady rhythm against the chaotic drumming of the thunder. Slowly, the fight went out of her. Her struggles subsided. Her frantic breathing began to slow. She sagged against him, her screams turning into ragged, exhausted sobs. He held her until the storm inside her passed, until she was just a woman trembling in a man's arms in a small cabin in the middle of a thunderstorm. They stayed like that for a long time, the only sounds the dying rumble of the thunder and her soft, shuddering breaths. She finally pulled back, her face streaked with tears in the dim firelight. She looked at him, her eyes clear for the first time, filled with a raw and painful vulnerability. She finally asked the question that had been hovering between them since the beginning, a bridge of words across the chasm of their shared pain. "Have you ever done something?" she asked, her voice a broken whisper. "Something you can't forgive yourself for?" Caleb looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he let her see all the way into the desolate landscape of his soul. He let her see the fire, the ghosts, the woman named Rachel. He did not have to say the words. She had read them in the letter, but he gave them to her anyway, a confession and a covenant. "Every day," he answered, his voice thick with a decade of unshed grief. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and cool. Caleb was stoking the morning fire when a soft sound made him turn. Elise was standing in the doorway of her room. She was wrapped in the old gray wool blanket she had arrived in, the one he had cleaned and folded at the end of his bed. It was all she was wearing. Her feet were bare on the cold floorboards. Her hair was loose, falling over her shoulders, and her face was scrubbed clean of everything but a profound, aching weariness. She met his gaze, and there was no fear in her eyes now, only a quiet, desperate question. She took a step toward him. "Do you still think I owe you nothing?" she asked softly. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. He saw the offer in her eyes. The last, most desperate currency of a woman who had been taught her body was the only thing of value she possessed. He saw her trying to pay a debt she did not owe, trying to find human connection in the only way she had ever known. And a war raged inside him. Every lonely, hungry part of him wanted to say yes, to cross the space between them, to take the comfort she was offering and lose himself in it. He wanted to forget who he was, to forget the blood on his hands and the ghosts in his heart. But he saw Rachel's face in his mind, heard her words from the letter. "You were meant to protect, not to destroy. To take Elise now, in her brokenness, would be a kind of destruction. It would make him no better than William Harrow, no better than any man who had ever used her. It would make his redemption a lie." His jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped. A tremor ran through his body. With an effort that seemed to cost him everything, he turned his back on her. He walked to the cabin door, his steps heavy and wooden. He opened it and stepped out into the cold morning air, pulling the door shut behind him. He did not look back. He spent the rest of the night outside, sitting with his back against the cold logs of the cabin, the rifle across his lap. He did not feel the chill that seeped into his bones. He was haunted by the image of her standing in the doorway, by the ghost of a desire so powerful it had almost undone him, and by the cold, hard certainty that protecting her meant he first had to fight himself. The morning after he had walked out on her, a new kind of silence fell over the cabin. It was no longer the cautious, watchful quiet of two strangers sharing a space. It was a dense, charged atmosphere, heavy with the memory of her whispered question and his silent refusal. An invisible line had been drawn between them, and Caleb Danner spent his days on one side of it, working with a frantic, punishing energy, while Elise watched him from the other. He avoided her. If he needed to be in the cabin, he would wait until he saw her go to the creek. If she was by the hearth, he would stay in the barn, mending tech that did not need mending. He was ashamed, not of his refusal, but of the raw, desperate desire that had nearly consumed him. He had seen the truth in that moment. He was not a reformed man, just a man on a very short leash, and the wolf inside him was still hungry. He was afraid of that hunger, afraid of what it meant, afraid that one moment of weakness would prove he was no different from the men who had scarred her, no different from Silas Durant. He was afraid of himself. From the cabin window, Elise saw not rejection in his avoidance, but a kind of tormented honor. She had offered herself up as a payment, the only way she knew to settle a debt. It was what William Harrow had taught her. A woman's worth was measured in her beauty and her compliance. But Caleb had refused the payment. In turning his back, he had given her something she did not realize she had lost, a piece of her own value, separate from her body. He had seen her as a person, not a ledger to be balanced. And for that, a strange and fragile respect began to grow in the barren soil of her heart. She began to see the war he fought, not against the world, but against himself, and in that, she recognized a fellow soldier. The tension stretched for days. A wire pulled taut between them, humming with unspoken feelings. Finally, the practicalities of survival forced his hand. The flour sack was nearly empty, and the coffee tin was down to its last few beans. He had to go to town. He announced it after their silent breakfast. His words clipped. "I am riding in for supplies. I will be back before dark." She simply nodded, her eyes on the worn wooden table. She did not ask him to bring her anything. She never did. The ride to town was a grim necessity. He felt the familiar weight of eyes on him as he rode down the main street. The whispers followed him like flies. He tied his horse in front of the general store and strode inside, his jaw set. As he gathered his goods, he could feel the storekeeper, a man named Henderson, watching him. "Heard William Harrow's put up a reward," Henderson said, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp. "A hefty one. For a runaway girl. Seems she stole something of his—" Caleb kept his face impassive as he hefted a sack of flour onto the counter. "Is that so?" "Aye. His men were in the saloon yesterday. 2 of them, loudmouths, describing her, dark hair, gray eyes, said she was Harrow's property." Henderson leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Said she was a whore he'd taken in out of pity, and she'd run off on him, offering $500 for her return. No questions asked." The word, ugly and sharp, landed like a punch in Caleb's gut. He thought of Elise's quiet dignity, the stubborn pride in her eyes. He felt a white-hot rage rise in him, so powerful he had to grip the edge of the counter to keep his hands from shaking. He could picture the men, arrogant and cruel, soiling her name in a room full of strangers. "You have not seen anyone like that out your way, have you, Caleb?" Henderson asked, his eyes gleaming with a mix of greed and curiosity. Caleb looked up, meeting the man's gaze. He let a cold, dead emptiness settle into his own eyes, the look he had perfected years ago, the one that made people back away. "My only company is my own, Henderson. You know that." He paid for his supplies and left, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. He loaded the sacks onto his horse and was about to mount when 2 men stepped out of the saloon. They were big men, dressed in clothes too fine for the dusty town, with silver-inlaid gun belts and an air of swaggering authority. They matched the description he'd formed in his mind. One of them noticed Caleb and his loaded pack horse. "You there," the man called out, his voice thick with liquor and arrogance. "You live out on the mesa, do you not?" Caleb did not answer. He put his foot in the stirrup. "We are looking for someone," the other man said, stepping forward. "A girl. Maybe you have seen her. Skinny thing, looks like a kicked pup." Caleb swung himself into the saddle. He looked down at the men, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "The only things I see on the mesa are coyotes and rattlesnakes." He pulled on the reins, turning his horse. "You boys should be careful. It is easy to get lost out there." He rode out of town without looking back, the men's angry curses following him. He pushed his horse hard, the urgency a physical spur. The lie he had told felt thin and temporary. $500 was a fortune. It was enough to make a man forget his conscience, enough to make a neighbor turn on a neighbor. They were not safe. She was not safe. He burst into the cabin, his face a grim mask. Elise looked up from the fire where she was stirring a pot of stew, startled by his sudden entrance. He dropped the supply sacks on the floor with a heavy thud. "Pack what you have," he said, his voice tight and urgent. "We have to leave, now." She stared at him, her eyes wide with confusion and a flicker of fear. "What? Why? What happened?" "Harrow's men are in town. They are offering a reward for you. $500. He ran a hand through his hair, his movements jerky. "They are calling you. They are spreading lies. It is not safe here anymore. Someone will sell you out for that kind of money. We have to run." He expected her to crumble, to see the old terror return to her eyes. He was ready to grab her arm and pull her along if he had to, but she did not crumble. She set the spoon down carefully on the hearth and rose to her feet. She stood before him, smaller than him by a head, yet her posture was anything but weak. The fear was in her eyes, yes, but it was tempered with something else, something hard and defiant he had never seen there before. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm as bedrock. He stared at her, uncomprehending. "What do you mean, no? Did you not hear me? They are looking for you. They will find you." "And what then? Caleb?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. "We run. We ride until they get tired of looking, and then we find another piece of empty land and wait. We wait until he sends more men. We spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. I've been running my whole life. From my father, from Harrow. I ran from here once, and it nearly killed me." She took a step closer, closing the distance between them. She looked up into his face, her stormy eyes searching his. "I am done running," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "The question is, are you?" Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. "Are you?" She had turned it all back on him. His life for the past 10 years had been nothing but running. Running from the Durant gang, from his memories, from the man he used to be. He built fences around his land, but they were nothing compared to the walls he had built around his heart. He had chosen solitude not for peace, but as a form of exile, a way to keep his past from catching up to him. And now this woman, this broken thing he had taken in, was telling him to stand and fight. She was asking him to face the very thing he had spent a decade fleeing. A new era began on the ranch that day. The invisible line between them dissolved, replaced by a shared, unspoken purpose. If they were to stay, they had to be ready. "I do not know how to fight," Elise admitted that afternoon, her voice stripped of its earlier defiance, now filled with a quiet resolve. "I will teach you," he said. He started with the rifle. He took her out to the edge of the canyon, the same place where his memories so often found him. He set up an old tin can on a fence post 50 yards away. He showed her how to hold the heavy Winchester, how to brace its stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel. His hands covered hers, his fingers guiding her, adjusting her grip. The touch was impersonal, instructional, yet a current of heat passed between them. He was close enough to smell the clean scent of her hair, to feel the slight tremor in her arms as she took the weight of the weapon. "Breathe out slow," he said, his voice a low murmur by her ear. "Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it." The rifle boomed, the recoil knocking her back a step. The can remained untouched. Day after day, they practiced. Her shoulder was bruised, her arms ached, but she never complained. She learned to load and clean the weapon, her movements becoming less hesitant, more sure. And finally, one afternoon, she squeezed the trigger and the tin can flew off the post, spinning through the air. A small, triumphant smile touched her lips. The first real smile he had ever seen on her face. It transformed her, chasing the shadows from her eyes for a fleeting moment. Caleb felt his own lips twitch in response. She insisted on learning more. She followed him through his daily chores, her quiet determination a constant presence at his side. He taught her how to properly saddle a horse, how to read the sky for weather, how to tell a sick calf from a healthy one. She learned to muck out the barn, to feed the livestock, to chop kindling for the fire. The work was hard and unfamiliar, but she attacked it with a ferocious energy, as if she were trying to rebuild herself, one chore at a time. Their shared labor filled the silence. They began to talk, not of the past, but of the present, of the fence that needed mending, of the hawk circling overhead, of the way the light turned the mesas purple at sunset. They began to eat their meals together, sitting across from each other at the small table. Their relationship was no longer about survival. It was about partnership. He was no longer her savior, and she was no longer his victim. They were two people holding a precarious piece of ground against a hostile world, and they were holding it together. One night, as a sliver of moon hung in a black sky, Caleb's past came stumbling out of the darkness. A frantic pounding on the cabin door startled them both from a comfortable silence by the fire. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, his Colt in his hand, motioning for Elise to get back. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice hard. A weak, rasping voice answered, a voice he had not heard in 10 years but recognized instantly. "Caleb, it is me. It is Finn. Let me in, for God's sake. I am dying." Caleb's face went pale. Finn O'Malley. He had been the youngest of the Durant gang, a boy with laughing eyes and a reckless heart. Caleb unbolted the door and pulled it open. The man who stumbled inside was a skeleton. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, his eyes burned with fever, and a bloody cough rattled in his chest. He collapsed on the floor, a bundle of rags and disease. Elise gasped, pressing herself into the corner of the room, her hand flying to her mouth. "They left me," Finn wheezed, looking up at Caleb with desperate eyes. "The sickness took me, and they just rode off." Caleb knelt beside him, his face a mixture of pity and disgust. "What are you doing here, Finn? How did you find me?" "I've been looking for years." Finn coughed, a spray of blood speckling the floorboards. "Heard a man matching your description had holed up out here. Had to see." He broke into another racking cough. "I need a place to stay. Caleb, just for a night or two. A place to die." Elise stared at the scene, her heart pounding with a cold, terrifying dread. This was his world. This was the violence and decay he had come from, and it had followed him here. It had walked right through their door. Caleb lifted the dying man and carried him to his own bedroll by the fire. He gave him water and tried to make him comfortable. Elise watched, her body rigid with fear and a rising tide of anger. When Finn had drifted into a fevered sleep, she confronted Caleb, her voice a furious whisper. "You are letting him stay, a man from that gang, here, with me in this house?" "He is dying. Elise," Caleb said, his voice weary. He would not meet her eyes. "I do not care. He is one of them. The men who are like Harrow, who take what they want and destroy what they can't have. You invite that into our home, after you told me we had to run from it? It is not the same." "How is it not the same?" she demanded, her voice rising. "You punch a neighbor for a cruel word, but you give your own bed to a killer. Why do you protect everyone but yourself? Caleb, it is like you want the past to catch you. It is like you want to be punished." Her words hit their mark. He finally looked at her, his face haggard in the firelight, his eyes filled with a torment so profound it stole her breath. "Maybe I do," he said, his voice raw. "You do not understand. The things I have done, the people who are dead because of me, there is a debt, and it can never be paid." He gestured toward the sleeping form of Finn. "He is a part of that debt. So was the family that burned. So was Rachel. He finally said her name out loud to Elise, and the sound was like a stone dropping into a deep, dark well. I can never be clean. The best I can do is try to balance the ledger before I die. Elise looked at his tortured face, and her anger dissolved, replaced by a wave of aching sadness. She saw a man so imprisoned by his own guilt that he could not see the good in himself, the good that she saw every day. The man who had refused to take advantage of her, who had taught her to be strong, who had faced down Harrow's men for her. You are wrong, she said softly. She stepped closer, her hand reaching out, wanting to touch his arm, but she let it fall. You think balancing a ledger will save you? All you are doing is tying yourself to the dead. You owe them nothing, Caleb. You owe it to yourself, to Rachel, to live, but you cannot do that if you are always looking backward. He just shook his head, a gesture of deep, unshakable despair. Listen to me, she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate strength. If you never forgive yourself for what you have done, you will never be worthy of a future, and you will never, ever deserve to be loved. The words hung in the air between them, stark and true. He stared at her, his defenses finally, utterly breached. She had seen him, all of him, and she had not run. She had stayed and spoken the truth he had been too afraid to face himself. Later that night, the cabin was quiet except for the ragged breathing of the dying man by the fire. Caleb sat in his chair, staring into the flames, Elise's words echoing in his mind. You will never deserve to be loved. He heard a soft footfall on the floorboards behind him. He did not need to turn to know it was her. He felt her presence, a warmth at his back. She came to stand beside his chair. This time, she was not wrapped in a blanket. She wore the simple cotton shift she slept in. There was no offer of payment in her eyes, no desperation. There was only a profound, soul-deep empathy. She was not a victim, and he was not a savior. They were just a man and a woman, scarred and scared, and utterly alone in the world, except for each other. She reached out and gently took his hand. Her fingers were warm, her touch sending a shock through his system. He looked from her hand to her face. Her eyes were shining in the firelight. Without a word, she led him away from the fire, away from the ghost of his past sleeping on the floor, and toward the small, quiet room that had been her sanctuary. She did not let go of his hand. She stood before him, her gaze never leaving his, and slowly, she reached for the hem of her shift. This time, he did not walk away. He reached out, his calloused, trembling fingers stopping hers. He shook his head. A small, almost imperceptible movement. He raised his hand and gently, reverently, cupped her face, his thumb stroking the line of her jaw where a bruise had once been. A tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. He wiped it away. In that small, quiet room, two scarred souls finally laid down their weapons. Their coming together was not a storm of passion, but a quiet, desperate seeking of solace. It was a tender exploration, a mapping of scars, both visible and not. His hands, which had known only the cold steel of a gun and the rough labor of the land, were impossibly gentle. Her touch, which had only ever been a thing to be endured, became a thing of discovery. It was a silent conversation in a language of touch, a confession of loneliness, a prayer for forgiveness, an acceptance of grace. In each other's arms, they were not a fallen woman and a haunted killer. They were just Elise and Caleb, and for the first time, in the fragile shelter they created together, they were not afraid. They were home. The first light of dawn crept into the cabin, soft and gray, chasing the last of the shadows from the corners of the room. Caleb woke to the warmth of Elise beside him, her breathing a slow, steady rhythm against his chest. He lay still for a long time, watching the dust motes dance in the growing light, feeling a sense of quiet that was entirely new. It was not the empty silence of solitude, but a full and resonant peace that seemed to emanate from the woman sleeping in his arms. He carefully slipped from the bed, his movements practiced and silent. The dying outlaw, Finn, was gone. Sometime in the night, his ragged breathing had ceased. Caleb had carried the man's emaciated body out into the darkness and buried him in a shallow, unmarked grave on the far side of the ridge, a final debt paid to a life of ruin. As he rekindled the fire, he heard a soft sound and turned. Elise was standing there, wrapped in a blanket, her hair a dark, tangled cloud around her shoulders. She looked at the empty space where Finn had been, then at Caleb. No questions were needed. She understood. She came to the hearth and began to make coffee, their movements falling into an easy, familiar pattern, a domestic ballet that felt both strange and deeply natural. Later that morning, as Caleb was outside splitting logs for the fire, he saw her by the cabin's single, grimy window. She was holding a small tin cup and a rag. She had found a small pouch of his with some marking chalk in it, blue for marking cattle, and had crushed it into a fine powder, mixing it with water to create a thin, pale paint. With a focused intensity, she began to trace the outline of a simple wildflower onto the corner of the window frame. She worked slowly, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. As she worked, a soft, tuneless humming sound came from her throat, a half-forgotten melody from a life before Harrow. Caleb stood frozen, his axe resting on the chopping block. The sight of her, this small act of creation, of bringing color and life into his drab, colorless world, struck him with a force that stole his breath. He watched the delicate blue line take shape under her fingers, listened to the quiet, hopeful sound of her humming, and felt a crack appear in the icy wall around his heart. A slow, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest, and for the first time in 10 years, a smile, small and hesitant, but undeniably real, touched Caleb Danner's lips. That afternoon, they sat together on the porch steps, watching the sun dip toward the distant mesas. The air between them was comfortable, the silence easy. It was Elise who finally broke it. "Rachel," she said, the name a soft question. "The woman who wrote the letter. You loved her." It was not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. Caleb stared out at the horizon, his newfound peace evaporating, replaced by the familiar shadow of his grief. He had known this was coming. He owed Elise the truth, all of it. "I did," he said, his voice a low rasp. "More than I figured a man like me was allowed to love anything." He told her the story, the words coming slowly, painfully, like pulling shards of glass from an old wound. He had met Rachel in a small town in the Texas Panhandle. She was the preacher's daughter, all light and goodness, and he was a young outlaw with the devil in his eyes. She should have been afraid of him, but she was not. She had seen something else in him, something he did not even know was there. "She wanted me to leave the gang," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Silas Durant. He was like a father to me. He found me when I was a boy, taught me how to survive. I thought I owed him my loyalty. Rachel said I owed myself a life." They had planned to run away together, but Durant found out. He saw Rachel as a threat, a weakness in his best gun. He gave Caleb an order, a cruel and pointless test of loyalty, to ride with the gang and burn out a small-time rancher who had spoken out against them. Caleb refused. It was the first time he had ever defied Silas Durant. "I told him I was done," Caleb continued, his eyes fixed on a past only he could see. "I went to get Rachel. I was going to take her and ride west. Never look back." He paused, his throat working. "But I was too late. Durant sent the others. They went to the rancher's place, but he was gone. So they came for me. They came to the boarding house where I was staying. They thought I was inside." His voice broke. "They did not know Rachel had come to meet me there. She was waiting for me in my room. They threw the torches, just like they did with that family. They set the whole place on fire. I got there. I saw the flames. I tried to get in, but the whole building was an inferno. I heard her screaming. The last word was a choked, strangled sound. He fell silent, his body rigid, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on his knees. "I killed the man who threw the first torch," he said, his voice flat and dead. "Shot him right there in the street. The others ran. I ran, too. I ran from the fire, from her ghost, from Durant. I ran until I found this place, where I figured I could not hurt anyone else." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes hollowed out by grief and self-loathing. "She died because of me. Elise, because I was weak. Because I was a coward who could not walk away sooner. The fire was my fault." Elise listened, her heart aching for him. When he was finished, she did not offer him empty words of comfort. She did not tell him it was not his fault. She simply reached out and laid her hand on his, her warm fingers covering his clenched fist. She said nothing, but in her touch, in the quiet strength of her presence, he felt a flicker of absolution, a silent understanding that he had not felt in a decade of lonely penance. The peace was short-lived. The next morning, Elise was returning from the creek, a bucket of water in each hand, when she saw something that made her stop cold, a set of fresh tracks in the damp earth near the tree line, not 50 yards from the cabin. 3 horses. They had been there recently, likely in the pre-dawn hours, watching the cabin. She set the buckets down carefully and studied the prints. The lessons Caleb had given her came back to her. She saw how the horses had stood for a long time, how they had turned and ridden back the way they came, toward the east, toward town. She ran back to the cabin, her heart pounding. "Caleb," she said, her voice tight with urgency as she burst through the door. "They were here. 3 riders. They were watching us." He was at her side in an instant, his face grim. Together, they went and looked at the tracks. He knelt, his fingers tracing the edge of a hoof print. "You are right," he said, his eyes scanning the surrounding terrain. "They are scouting, testing our defenses. They will be back." They spent the rest of the day preparing. They were no longer just surviving. They were fortifying. They boarded up the small window in Elise's room. Caleb checked and rechecked their weapons, his Colt, the Winchester, and the older revolver from the locked drawer, which he gave to her. He showed her how to reload it quickly, how to handle its heavier kick. They brought extra water into the cabin and stacked ammunition on the table. The small space, which had just begun to feel like a home, was transformed into a fortress. As dusk began to settle, casting long shadows across the canyon, Elise stood by the door, the revolver heavy in her hand. A cold knot of fear was coiled in her stomach, but it was different from the paralyzing terror she had known before. This was a sharp, focused fear, the fear of a fighter before the battle. Caleb came to stand beside her. "When they come," he said, his voice low and steady, "I want you to stay in the back room. Bar the door, no matter what you hear." She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with an intensity that startled him. "No," she said. I will not hide in a dark room while you fight for me. I am not a prize to be protected. Caleb, I am not a damsel in a storybook." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a fierce, passionate whisper. "I have spent my whole life being treated like something that needs to be hidden away or locked up, something to be saved. William Harrow tried to save me from my father's poverty. My father tried to save himself by selling me. I am done being saved." She looked down at the gun in her hand, then back up at him, her gaze unwavering. "You taught me how to use this. You taught me how to be strong. Are you going to tell me now that it was all for nothing? That I am still just the helpless woman you found in the rain?" She took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "I am not just yours to save. Caleb, I am yours to fight with." He looked into her eyes and saw not a victim, but a warrior. He saw a strength that matched his own, a will forged in a fire as terrible as any he had known. He saw his partner. He gave a slow, solemn nod. "All right," he said. "We fight together." They came 2 days later. In the heat of the afternoon, a small posse of 4 men rode up to the cabin. They did not ride like lawmen. They rode with a lazy arrogance, as if they owned the ground beneath their horses' hooves. The man in the lead was dressed in a dusty black coat and wore a tarnished silver star pinned to his vest. Caleb watched them approach through a crack in the door, his body tense. "They are pretending to be the law," he murmured. He felt Elise at his side, her presence a steadying warmth. "I recognize the one on the right," Caleb said, his voice turning to ice. "His name is Jedediah. He rode with Durant for a while, a nasty piece of work." This was not just Harrow's men. This was his past and her present, joined together in an unholy alliance. "They will try to talk their way in," Caleb said, his mind racing. "We have to get them inside. Separate them." Elise looked at him, her eyes clear and focused. "I can do it," she said. "What?" "They are looking for a kicked pup," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "A runaway whore. Let me give them what they expect to see." Before he could argue, she had a plan. He did not like it, but he knew she was right. It was their only chance. He took his position behind the heavy overturned table, the Winchester resting on its edge. Elise took a deep breath, smoothed her dress, and undid the top 2 buttons, her face transforming into a mask of fear and submission. She opened the door just as the man with the star was about to knock. She stood there, trembling, her eyes wide with feigned terror. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Please do not hurt me." The men on the porch grinned, exchanging triumphant looks. The leader, the man wearing the star, dismounted and stepped forward. "Well now, look what we have here. No need to be scared. Little lady, we are the law. We are here to take you home. Back to Mr. Harrow." "He is not here," Elise said, her voice a pathetic whimper. "The man who lives here, he went out hunting. He will be back soon." She backed away into the cabin, letting them follow. "That is all right," the leader said, his eyes roaming greedily over the cabin and over her. "We will just wait for him." He stepped inside, followed by Jedediah and 1 other man. The 4th man remained outside with the horses. "It is cold in here," Jedediah complained, rubbing his hands together. "Why do you not have a fire going, girl?" I do not have any wood," Elise stammered, shrinking away from him. "He keeps it locked up." It was the signal. Jedediah grunted and turned his back on the room, heading toward the back door that led to the woodpile. It was exactly as they had planned. The moment Jedediah's back was turned, Caleb rose from behind the table. The Winchester boomed in the enclosed space, the sound deafening. Jedediah was thrown forward, a hole blossoming in his back. He crashed through the flimsy back door and lay still. The leader whirled around, his hand flying to his gun, his face a mask of shock and rage. But Elise was already moving. The frightened victim was gone, replaced by a vengeful fury. She brought the heavy iron skillet from the hearth around in a vicious arc, crashing it into the side of the leader's head. He staggered, a look of stunned disbelief on his face, just as Caleb's rifle roared again. The man was thrown backward against the wall and slid to the floor, his fake star spattered with his own blood. The 3rd man in the room, younger than the others, had his gun out, firing wildly. A bullet splintered the table next to Caleb's head. From the corner of the room, the old revolver barked twice. The young man cried out, clutching his chest, and collapsed. Elise stood there, the gun smoking in her hand, her face pale but her hand steady. Caleb vaulted over the table and ran for the front door, knowing the 4th man would have heard the shots. He kicked the door open just as the man was raising his rifle. Caleb fired from the hip. The man was knocked from his saddle, landing in a heap in the dust. Silence. The sudden Ringing silence after the cacophony of violence was overwhelming. The air in the cabin was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the coppery tang of blood. It stained the floorboards, pooling in dark, ugly puddles. The bodies lay where they had fallen. The fight had lasted less than 30 seconds. Caleb stood in the doorway, his rifle smoking, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at Elise. She was still standing in the same spot, the revolver held loosely at her side. She looked at the blood, at the bodies of the men who had come to drag her back to her cage, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Then she looked at Caleb, and her expression was not one of fear or regret, but of grim, terrible victory. He buried them that evening. He dragged the bodies out of his home, one by one, and took them deep into the canyon. He dug a single, wide grave and rolled them in, without ceremony, without a prayer. It was grim, ugly work, and he did it alone. This was his burden to carry, his penance. But this time was different. This time, he was not truly alone. As he worked, the sweat stinging his eyes, he would look back toward the cabin, and he would see her silhouette sitting on the porch steps, the Winchester rifle resting across her lap. She was keeping watch. She was protecting him. That night, a storm rolled over the mesa, the wind howling around the corners of the cabin, the rain lashing against the roof. The floor was scrubbed clean, but they could both still see the dark stains that had seeped between the floorboards. They sat close together by the fire, the warmth a small comfort against the cold reality of what they had done. The ghosts in the cabin had new faces now. Elise leaned her head against his shoulder. The storm outside was a pale imitation of the one they had just weathered. "You fought your past," she whispered, her voice a soft murmur against the sound of the wind. "You fought for me, but you do not have to fight me, Caleb." He turned and looked down at her, at the fierce, brave, beautiful woman who had faced down her own demons and his. He was tired. Tired of the killing, tired of the running, tired of the ghosts, tired of the long, lonely war he had waged against himself. He leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I am tired of fighting," he said, and in the warm glow of the firelight, surrounded by the storm, he held her close and finally, let himself feel at peace. 4 missing men, even men of ill repute wearing fake badges, do not go unnoticed for long in a territory as sparsely populated as eastern New Mexico. Word trickled back to town like a slow poison. Tales of a brief, brutal gunfight at the Danner Ranch. Stories pieced together from the gossip of a passing trapper who had heard the shots and the fear of a neighbor who had been warned away with a punch. The whispers grew, and soon they reached the ears of Sheriff Barnes. A week after the fight, the sheriff rode out to the cabin. He did not come with a posse, but alone, his face grim and sweating under the noon sun. Caleb saw him coming from a long way off and met him in the yard. His posture relaxed, but his eyes watchful. Elise stood in the doorway of the cabin, the old revolver held loosely at her side, a silent sentinel. "Caleb," Barnes said, staying on his horse. He nodded curtly at Elise. "Ma'am." His eyes swept the property, lingering on the fresh earth where the back door had been repaired and the dark stains on the porch that no amount of lye soap could fully erase. 4 men came out this way. They have not been seen since. "They found what they were looking for," Caleb said, his voice flat. The sheriff sighed, shifting his considerable weight in the saddle. The leather creaked in protest. "Listen to me, Danner. I am here as a courtesy, not as the law, because right now, the law is not on your side. William Harrow is a powerful man. He has friends in Santa Fe, territorial officials who listen when he talks. He is saying you abducted his legal ward." "She is not his ward. She is not his anything," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "It does not matter what she is," Barnes said, his voice laced with a weary frustration. "It only matters what a man like Harrow says she is. He has put a warrant out for her return, a legal one. This time he wants her back, Caleb. And he is not sending thugs anymore. He is planning on sending the territorial rangers. The threat hung in the hot, still air. The rangers were a different breed. They were hard men who followed orders and did not ask questions. Against them, Caleb and Elise would stand no chance. He is pulling strings, Barnes continued, wiping a sleeve across his sweaty brow. Calling in favors. He wants this handled quietly, but he will have it handled one way or another. He wants the girl returned. He told me to tell you that if she is brought back to him, no harm done. He will forget this whole business. No charges will be filed for his missing men. You can walk away. Caleb stared at the sheriff, his face a mask of stone. He thought of the scars on Elise's wrists, of the terror in her eyes during the thunderstorm, of the quiet hope in her voice as she hummed while painting his window. He thought of her hand in his, a small, warm anchor in the wreckage of his life. Walk away. The words were a mockery of everything he had just found. You tell Harrow, Caleb said, his voice as cold and final as a grave, that he will have to kill me. Sheriff Barnes held his gaze for a long moment, then shook his head, a gesture of defeat. I figured you would say that. I am sorry, Caleb, I truly am. But when they come for you, I will not be able to help. He turned his horse and rode away, a solitary, powerless figure receding into the shimmering heat. Elise had heard it all from the doorway. She watched the sheriff disappear, then looked at Caleb. His back was to her, his shoulders set in a line of grim, unshakable resolve. He would die for her. He would stand on this small patch of dirt and let the full weight of Harrow's power and the law itself crash down upon him. All to protect her. And in that moment, she felt a love for him so fierce it was painful, immediately followed by a wave of guilt so profound it threatened to drown her. She was a plague. Everywhere she went, she brought ruin. She had brought shame to her father, and now she had brought a death sentence to Caleb. He had been safe in his solitude, protected by his ghosts. She had broken through his walls only to lead his enemies to the gate. He had fought his past, and she had dragged him into a fight for a future he would now never have. She could not let him die for her. The price was too high. That night, she loved him with a quiet, desperate intensity. She traced the lines of his face in the moonlight, memorizing the shape of his jaw, the scar above his eyebrow. She committed to memory the feel of his calloused hands on her skin, the low rumble of his voice in the darkness. It was a farewell. When she was sure he was deep asleep, she slipped out of their bed. Her movements were silent, a phantom in the moonlight that streamed through the window she had painted with wildflowers. She found a piece of paper and a nub of charcoal. By the faint glow of the dying embers in the hearth, she wrote him a letter. Her tears fell onto the paper, smudging the words. My dearest Caleb, you told me once that you owed a debt to the dead. I cannot let you become another one of them on my account. The man you are, the good, honorable man you have shown me, deserves to live. He deserves the peace you have fought so hard to find. I have brought you nothing but trouble and violence, and I cannot bear to be the reason for your end. Do not think I am running from Harrow. I am running to save you. Do not follow me. Please, I beg of you. Live a long life. Forgive yourself. Think of me sometimes. I will be thinking of you. Always. Yours, Elise. She folded the note and left it on the pillow where her head had lain. She dressed quickly in the practical clothes he had bought for her. She took the older revolver and a small sack of food, some jerky and a piece of cornbread. She went to the barn, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She saddled his dun gelding, the faster of their two horses, her hands moving with a sure and steady purpose born of utter heartbreak. She led the horse out into the yard, swung herself into the saddle, and, without a single look back at the small cabin that had been her first true home, she rode east, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. Elise did not ride aimlessly. She had a destination, a fragile sliver of hope she had clung to since her darkest days in Harrow's mansion. She remembered a young serving girl there, a girl named Mary, whose eyes held the same haunted look as her own. One night, Mary had been caught stealing a piece of bread. Harrow had ordered her whipped as an example. Later that night, as Elise had secretly tended to the girl's bleeding back, Mary had whispered of a place, a sanctuary for women like them. It was a small, hidden mission run by nuns. 2 days' ride south, near the San Augustin Pass. They help women disappear, Mary had whispered before she herself vanished a week later. It was a desperate, half-forgotten rumor, but it was all she had. As she rode, the rising sun casting long shadows behind her, the memories she had fought so hard to suppress came flooding back. She was back in Harrow's house, a place of suffocating beauty and cold, precise cruelty. It was a gilded cage in the truest sense. She had silk dresses but was forbidden to walk in the gardens without his permission. The dining table was laden with fine food, but she was required to eat in silence, her eyes downcast. Any infraction, any flicker of defiance in her expression, was met with swift and terrible punishment. He called it discipline. He would lock her in her room for days with nothing but water, claiming it was to teach her gratitude. He would force her to stand in a corner for hours, motionless, to teach her humility. The physical abuse was rare, reserved for what he deemed serious transgressions, but the threat of it was a constant, suffocating presence. He was not a man of raging temper. His cruelty was calm, rational, and all the more terrifying for it. He was a master breaking a willful horse. He was not trying to kill her spirit, but to shape it, to mold it into a perfect, silent, obedient reflection of his own will. She remembered the endless silent evenings, the ticking of the grand clock in the hall, the only sound, his cold eyes on her, watching, always watching, waiting for a single misstep. Riding now, with the open sky above her, she knew she would rather die in the desert than return to that silent, beautiful prison. Caleb woke to an empty bed. The cabin was cold, the fire dead. He felt a sudden, sharp stab of unease. "Elise?" he called out, his voice rough with sleep. The silence that answered him was the old silence, the empty, lonely kind. He saw the folded piece of paper on her pillow. His hands trembled as he read it. The words blurred, each one a separate blow. "To save you, do not follow me!" A roar of rage and despair rose in his throat. He crushed the letter in his fist. Foolish, brave, impossible woman. Did she think he could just let her go? Did she think he could go back to the man he was before, living a half-life in this empty cabin? She was his life now. She was his peace. He did not hesitate. He dressed in a blur of frantic energy, his mind already calculating, planning. He checked his weapons, stuffed his saddlebags with ammunition, water, and what was left of the jerky. He saddled his remaining horse, a sturdy bay, and was in the saddle before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. He found her trail easily. She was not trying to hide it. He saw the tracks of his own dun gelding leading east, then south. He was a master tracker, a skill learned at Silas Durant's side, a dark art he now bent toward a single, desperate purpose. He saw where she had stopped for water, where she had pushed the horse too hard up a steep incline. He read the story of her flight in the dust, and his heart ached with a mixture of pride at her strength and terror for her safety. The desert was an unforgiving place, but it was not as unforgiving as the men who were hunting her. He rode relentlessly, the sun a hammer against his skull. The landscape was a blur of sagebrush and red rock. He did not stop to rest, barely stopping to let his horse drink. He was a man possessed, driven by a singular, terrifying vision, Harrow's men finding her before he did. By the second day, Elise was exhausted. Her body ached, and her water was running low. She had pushed the gelding hard, and the horse was tiring. She knew she was being followed. Twice, she had seen a plume of dust in the distance, too large for a single rider. She knew it was Harrow's men, fanning out across the territory, closing the net. She reached the river crossing in the late afternoon. The water was a muddy, sluggish ribbon, but it was the only water for 50 miles. She had to cross here. She let the horse drink, her eyes scanning the far bank, searching for any sign of the mission. It was as she was pulling the horse back from the water's edge that they appeared. 3 riders emerged from the cottonwood trees on the other side of the river. They were not the men from the cabin. These were harder, leaner men, their eyes cold and empty. They spread out, blocking her path. "Going somewhere, girl?" one of them asked, a cruel grin splitting his face. Elise's hand went to the revolver tucked in her belt, but she knew it was hopeless. 3 of them. She was a fair shot, but not that good. Not yet. "Mister, Harrow is very eager to see you again," the man said, dismounting and walking toward her, his boots splashing in the shallow water. "He was very displeased when you ran off. We have been looking for you for a long time." He reached her and grabbed the reins of her horse from her hand. His eyes roamed over her, insolent and degrading. "Heard you took up with that outlaw Danner. Must have been cozy out there in that little shack." He reached out and grabbed a fistful of her hair, yanking her head back. She cried out in pain. "You were prettier before he touched you," the man sneered, his face close to hers, his breath sour. "Mister, Harrow will have to teach you your manners all over again." He shoved her, hard. She stumbled and fell to her knees in the mud and water. The other 2 men laughed. They were enjoying this, drawing it out. They were in no hurry. It was the sound of the rifle shot that made them stop laughing. It was a single, sharp crack that echoed off the canyon walls. The man holding Elise's horse grunted, a look of surprise on his face, and then he pitched forward into the river, a dark hole in the center of his back. The other 2 whirled around, scrambling for their guns, their face masks of shock. On the ridge overlooking the river crossing, 100 yards away, sat a lone rider on a bay horse. Caleb. He had the Winchester to his shoulder. He fired again. The second man cried out and clutched his arm, his pistol falling into the water. The third man, a little smarter than the others, abandoned the fight. He spurred his horse back into the trees and disappeared, leaving his wounded companion behind. Caleb did not wait. He kicked his horse into a gallop, charging down the rocky slope toward the river. The wounded man, clutching his arm, tried to raise his fallen pistol. Caleb was off his horse before it had even stopped moving. The fight was brutal, close, and ugly. Caleb's rifle was useless at this range. He used it as a club, smashing it into the man's face. The man went down, but came up with a knife, slashing wildly. He caught Caleb across the forearm, a deep, burning slice. Caleb ignored the pain. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, knocking him backward into the river. They grappled in the shallow, muddy water, fists flying. The man was strong, desperate. He managed to get on top of Caleb, his hands closing around Caleb's throat, pushing his head under the water. Caleb's lungs screamed for air. He saw black spots dancing in his vision. His hands scrabbled in the mud and closed around a smooth, heavy river stone. With the last of his strength, he brought the stone up and slammed it into the side of the man's head, and again, the hands around his throat loosened. The man went limp. Caleb shoved the body off him and scrambled to his feet, gasping for air, his chest heaving. Blood from the cut on his arm mingled with the muddy water. He stood there for a long moment, the world tilting around him, his body screaming in protest. Then he looked at Elise. She was still kneeling where she had fallen, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. He staggered toward her, every step an effort. He fell to his knees in front of her, the fight finally draining out of him. He reached out a trembling, bloody hand and touched her face. She was real. She was safe. She flung her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, her body racked with sobs. She clung to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had tried to tear her apart. "You did not have to come," she whispered through cracked, trembling lips. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, his face buried in her hair. He breathed in her scent, the only thing that felt like home. "I always would," he replied, his voice a raw, ragged promise. The ride back to the cabin was a slow, painful procession. Caleb had cleaned and bound the gash on his own forearm, but his attention was entirely on Elise. He had lifted her onto his horse and walked beside it, one hand steadying her, the other holding the reins. She was battered and bruised, her body aching from the fall and the rough handling of Harrow's men, but the deepest wounds were not visible. She leaned against him, her exhaustion so complete it was a physical weight, and for the first time, she did not flinch from his touch. This time, when he nursed her, it was different. The stoic, careful distance he had once maintained was gone, replaced by an open and unabashed tenderness. He washed the mud from her face and hair not as a medic tending a wound, but as a lover caring for his beloved. His hands, usually so rough and calloused from work and war, were impossibly gentle. He spoon-fed her broth when she was too weak to hold the bowl, his voice a low, soothing murmur that asked for nothing but her comfort. He sat by her bed through the night, not as a watchful guardian, but as a partner. He would hold her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it, until she drifted into a restless sleep. When the nightmares came, twisting her features in the lantern light, he was there before the scream could form, his hand on her shoulder, his voice whispering her back to the safety of the present. "You are here, Elise," he would say, over and over. "You are safe. I am with you." She healed under the warmth of his care, her body and spirit mending in a way she had never thought possible. She began to let go of the rigid control she had held for so long. She let him see her weakness, her fear, and in return, he showed her a gentle strength that was a balm to her soul. The small cabin, once a simple refuge, became a sanctuary, a world unto itself where the ghosts of their pasts seemed, finally, to be losing their power. But the world outside their small sanctuary had not forgotten them. Harrow's influence was a long shadow, and it was beginning to fall across their lives. When Caleb rode into town for supplies and medicine for Elise, he was met with a wall of cold silence. Henderson, the storekeeper who had once been greedy for gossip, now refused to meet his eye, sliding his goods across the counter without a word. In the street, men who had once offered a curt nod now turned their backs. The whispers that had followed him before were now replaced by an open hostility. He was no longer just an outsider. He was a troublemaker, a man who had brought the wrath of William Harrow down upon their quiet corner of the world. The hostility escalated. One night, they were woken by a sound from the barn. Caleb grabbed his rifle and slipped outside to find his bay horse lame, a cruel, deep cut in its leg. It was a message, a warning. They were isolated, surrounded by an unseen enemy that wore the faces of their neighbors. The final blow came on a moonless night a week later. They were asleep, wrapped in the warmth and safety of each other's arms, when a smell, acrid and sharp, pierced the veil of their dreams. Smoke. Caleb was awake in an instant, his senses screaming. He looked toward the window and saw a terrifying, flickering orange glow. "Elise, get up! Fire!" he roared, pulling her from the bed. The cabin was already filling with thick, choking smoke. The roar from outside was not the wind. It was the sound of a blaze consuming their world. He grabbed their guns and a handful of ammunition, shoving the revolver into Elise's hand. He wrapped a wet rag around her face and pushed her toward the door. The heat was immense, the air searing his lungs. The front of the cabin was an inferno. Someone had thrown oil on the logs. "The back!" he yelled, his voice hoarse. He kicked open the flimsy back door, the same one Jedediah had crashed through, and a wall of flame and heat met them. The fire was everywhere. They were trapped for a desperate, heart-stopping second. He saw the past repeating itself, the fire, the screams, the woman he loved trapped in a burning building. A primal scream of rage and denial tore from his throat. He would not lose her. Not again. He saw one chance, the single window on the side wall, the one Elise had painted with wildflowers, was not yet fully engulfed. He shoved the table against the wall, grabbed a chair, and smashed it through the glass in the frame. He climbed up and through the opening, the flames licking at his boots, and reached back down for Elise. He pulled her through the jagged opening just as the roof began to groaning, a terrible sound of surrender. They scrambled away from the cabin, their lungs raw, their faces scorched by the heat, and fell to the ground, watching as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and embers, taking their home, their sanctuary. With it, they had escaped with their lives, their weapons, and the clothes on their backs. Nothing more. They found them the next morning, huddled in the rocks overlooking the smoking, blackened ruins of their life. Sheriff Barnes rode up, his face a mask of pity and grim resignation. "I heard what happened," he said, his voice heavy. He did not need to ask who had done it. They all knew. "This has gone too far." "Caleb." "It ended the moment it began," Caleb said, his voice a dead monotone. He held Elise close, her body trembling with shock and cold. "You have one chance," the sheriff said, his voice low and urgent. "This is the last time I can offer it. Disappear. Take the woman and ride out. Go to California, Oregon. I do not care. Just go. If you stay, I have to act. Harrow has the warrant. He has the officials in his pocket. The law will side with him. They will hunt you down as fugitives, and they will see you hang. Or worse. This is your only way out." Caleb looked at the smoldering ashes of his home, the physical manifestation of the 10 years he had spent trying to run from his past. He looked at Elise, at the soot on her face and the fierce, unbroken spirit in her eyes. He had been running his whole life. Elise had been running her whole life, and all that had brought them was this: ashes. There was nowhere left to run. He rose to his feet, pulling Elise up with him. He stood before the sheriff, no longer a haunted man in hiding, but a man who had found a reason to make a stand. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and steady, devoid of fear or doubt. "No," he said, "we are done disappearing." The ride to William Harrow's estate was long and silent. They rode double on Caleb's dun gelding, the horse Elise had fled on, a grim piece of irony that was not lost on either of them. They rode through the canyons and across the open plains, two small, determined figures against a vast, indifferent landscape. They were riding toward an ending, one way or another. Harrow's ranch was a monument to his power and arrogance. A pristine white house with tall columns stood in the center of a sprawling, unnaturally green lawn, an oasis of wealth in the middle of the harsh, dry country. A white fence, perfectly maintained, enclosed the property. Dozens of ranch hands and servants moved about, their expressions a mixture of subservience and fear. Caleb and Elise rode right through the main gate, their appearance causing an immediate stir. Men stopped their work to stare at the soot-stained man and woman on the tired horse, the rifle held ready in the man's hand. They rode up to the front of the grand house and stopped. William Harrow himself emerged onto the wide porch, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was dressed in a fine suit, his hair perfectly combed. He saw them, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He looked from Caleb to Elise, his gaze lingering on her with a possessive, triumphant gleam. "Well, well," Harrow said, his voice carrying across the manicured lawn. "The prodigal returns, and she has brought the stray dog that led her astray. I must thank you, Danner. You saved me the trouble of hunting her down myself." Caleb swung down from the horse and helped Elise to the ground. He stood before the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence, clear and sharp for all the assembled workers to hear. "I am not here to return anything to you, Harrow," Caleb said. "This woman is not your property. She is a free person, and you will not touch her again." Harrow laughed, a rich, condescending sound. "A free person? Danner, you are a fool. I own this valley. I own the law in this valley. I own her. I bought and paid for her. She is a thing, an object, a disobedient pet that needs to be retrained." He took a sip of his whiskey, his eyes fixed on Elise, stripping her bare with his gaze. "And I do so look forward to her lessons." He looked back at Caleb. "But you, Danner, you I will simply have killed. An unfortunate accident during a lawful arrest. Sheriff Barnes will be very understanding. I assure you." "You will not touch him," Elise said, her voice shaking but full of a cold fury. She stepped forward, out from behind the shelter of Caleb's body. Harrow's smile widened. He set his glass down on the porch railing and directed all his venom at her. "Look at you, filthy, defiant, ruined, riding all over the territory with this gutter trash. He has made you into what you always were. Deep down," he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a vicious, deliberate hiss, "a common whore." The word, spoken with such casual cruelty in the open air, was a physical blow. But before Caleb could raise his rifle, before he could act on the murderous rage that exploded in his chest, Elise moved. She surged up the porch steps, her face a mask of white-hot fury, and she slapped William Harrow across the face. The sound was like a pistol shot in the dead silence. Harrow staggered back, his hand flying to his cheek, his face a picture of stunned, apoplectic rage. In that split second, his arrogance and composure shattered, revealing the ugly, violent man beneath. "You filthy!" he snarled, raising his hand to strike her. He never finished the sentence. The Winchester rifle in Caleb's hand boomed, the sound echoing across the valley. William Harrow was thrown backward, a dark hole appearing in the center of his pristine white shirt. He collapsed on the polished floor of his porch and did not move again. A stunned silence fell over the yard. The ranch hands and servants stood frozen, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Caleb stood his ground, the rifle smoking in his hand, his gaze sweeping over the crowd of witnesses. Then, a movement. A young man, no more than a boy, a ranch hand with fear in his eyes, stepped forward from the crowd. "He deserved it," the boy said, his voice trembling but clear. "I saw him. I saw what he did to her, what he did to others. He was a monster." An older woman, a servant from the house, nodded in agreement, her face streaked with tears. "It is true," she whispered. "All of it." A murmur went through the crowd, a dam of fear and silence breaking, one after another. The people Harrow had terrorized for years found their voices, their stories spilling out, a chorus of confirmation. When Sheriff Barnes arrived, summoned by a panicked foreman, he was not met with a simple murder scene. He was met with a public execution and a crowd of witnesses all telling the same story. He looked at the body of the most powerful man in the territory, at the defiant man and woman standing over him, and at the faces of the people who were finally, blessedly free. He sighed, the weight of the law heavy on his shoulders. Reluctantly, he called it self-defense. They returned not to a home, but to a ruin. The blackened timbers of the cabin stood stark against the evening sky, a skeleton of the life they had briefly known. The air still smelled of ash and loss. They walked through the debris, their home reduced to nothing more than charred wood and broken memories. Elise knelt in the ashes where the front door used to be. Her fingers sifted through the soot and debris until they closed around something hard and curved. She pulled it out. It was a horseshoe, blackened and half-charred, but still intact, a small, simple object of luck and resilience. She held it in the palm of her hand, its weight a solid, hopeful thing. She looked up at Caleb, who stood watching her, his face etched with weariness and sorrow. Her own face was stained with soot and tears, but her eyes were clear and full of a strength he had never seen before. "We can start over," she said, her voice quiet but certain. Months passed. The harsh lines of winter softened into the green promise of spring. On the same patch of land, a new cabin stood. It was smaller than the first, built with new-cut lumber that smelled of pine and hard work. It was sturdy, modest, and filled with light. On the new window frames, a vibrant collection of wildflowers, blue, yellow, and red, were painted, a testament to a spirit that had refused to be extinguished. Elise had found some paints in town, and she spent her afternoons bringing color and life back into their world. Her soft humming once again a familiar sound on the ranch. Caleb had changed, too. The haunted solitary man was gone, replaced by someone lighter, someone who smiled easily. The neighboring ranchers, free from Harrow's oppressive influence, began to see Caleb not as an outlaw, but as the man who had set them free. They started to stop by, offering help, sharing news. A small community began to form around the once isolated ranch. Caleb started teaching some of the local children how to ride, how to shoot, how to be strong and self-reliant. He had finally found his true calling as a protector, a role he now filled not with violence, but with patience and wisdom. One morning, just as the sun was turning the eastern sky to rose and gold, Caleb woke. He turned and saw Elise beside him. She was wrapped in that same old threadbare gray blanket he had found her in, the one they had managed to save from the fire. But this time, she was not a broken, half-starved creature on the edge of death. She was propped up on one elbow, watching him, a warm, safe, and deeply contented smile on her face. She was home. She was his. He smiled back, a genuine, easy smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "You know," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble in the quiet of the new morning, "you can drop it any time. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from, so please feel free to comment below and connect with fellow listeners. Do not forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.